What happened to royal servants who knew too much? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter world. Or at least, one that pretended to be quiet. A world of candle-lit corridors, velvet curtains, and people who were paid to keep secrets, but often didn't. So, dim the lights. Let the hum of your room fade into the background, and imagine yourself standing in some drafty medieval hallway, where the walls have ears, and the ears are usually attached to someone with a broom. Because tonight, we're talking about royal servants, the cooks, the chambermaids, the cupbearers, the people who saw everything, and occasionally saw too much. Servants, after all, were the living furniture of every royal household. They dressed their monarchs, fed them, watched them cry, and sometimes, quite accidentally, helped them commit treason. And yet, for most of history, they were expected to vanish into the background, invisible, silent, loyal, of course, though not too loyal, because that could also get you killed. The line between trusted confidant and dangerous liability was thinner, in fact, than most royal patience, especially when a servant stumbled upon something inconvenient. Let's start somewhere suitably uncomfortable. The Tudor court. Because if there was ever a dynasty that made servants nervous, it was this one. Henry VIII, the king who collected wives like commemorative plates, relied heavily on his household staff. They dressed him, cleaned his elaborate banquets, and, on bad days, probably fetched his discarded marriage proposals out of the fireplace. But their greatest sin was proximity. Being close to Henry meant hearing things you shouldn't, seeing things you'd rather not, and occasionally finding yourself implicated in a crime you didn't commit. Take poor Mark Smeaton, for example, a musician in Henry's court, charming, talented, and far too close to Anne Boleyn. In 1536, when Anne fell out of favor, Henry's men needed someone to blame. Smeaton, conveniently low-born and conveniently terrified, was questioned about his relationship with the Queen. Torture followed. Naturally, and under the gentle persuasion of the rack, Mark confessed to adultery, a crime punishable by death. Historians still debate whether he even knew Anne that well, but facts didn't matter. He'd been near the royal scandal, and that was enough. Smeaton was executed, his only real mistake being proximity to power. This was the silent truth of royal service. You could serve a monarch faithfully for years, but one overheard whisper, one unlucky glance, could end your life. It wasn't loyalty that kept you alive. It was luck and a strong sense of when to suddenly develop selective hearing. Let's drift a little further back, to the courts of France, where servants didn't just see everything. They were often part of the spectacle. At Versailles, etiquette was a blood sport, and privacy was a myth. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, turned every moment, even dressing and undressing, into a kind of divine performance. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing him his shoes or holding the royal nightshirt. Imagine that, waking up at dawn to watch a man get dressed and pretending it's an honor. But for the lower servants, the real workers, the stakes were higher. They cleaned the king's chamber pots, kept his secrets, and learned quickly that gossip was a kind of currency. Sometimes fatal currency. One maid, Mademoiselle Desoyer, served Louis XIV's mistress, Madame de Montespan, the woman accused of participating in the infamous Affair of the Poisons. It was said that Montespan attended black masses, seeking to keep the king's love through. Questionable means involving powdered toads and baby bones. Desoyer was accused of knowing too much, of being present during certain ceremonies. She narrowly escaped execution. but lived the rest of her life under suspicion. Because once you'd seen what royalty tried to hide, you could never quite wash it off. Even the royal kitchens weren't safe from intrigue. Cooks were trusted with something more dangerous than secrets: food. In the medieval world, poison was the lazy assassin's weapon of choice, and kitchens were the perfect battleground. Cupbearers and tasters existed precisely because of this paranoia. Their job was to test the wine before the monarch drank it. A glamorous position, right up until the moment the drink was poisoned. There's a grim sort of irony in dedicating your life to ensuring someone else doesn't die, only to die proving it, but, of course, that was medieval logic at its finest. One unlucky servant of Ivan the Terrible learned this the hard way. The Tsar, known for his gentle, forgiving nature, which is to say, none of those things, accused his cupbearer of poisoning him after a particularly bad meal. He wasn't poisoned, of course, just in a mood, but the servant was executed anyway, because nothing soothed Ivan's temper quite like killing the help. Royal servants also carried out tasks that no one else dared touch. They handled the king's chamber pot, dressed his wounds, even cut his toenails, all while pretending it was an honor. And in return, they gained knowledge that could undo empires: a trembling hand during a meal, a whispered name in a dream, a sign that the royal body, that sacred, political object, was failing. Because to know a monarch's secrets was to know the kingdom's weakness, and that made you dangerous. Let's drift now to England again. This time to Elizabeth I. Her court was a nest of spies and whisperers, where every maid might also be an informant. Elizabeth herself understood the value of secrecy. She kept her illnesses quiet, her affections quieter, and her servants under constant watch. Her chamber women, those who dressed and attended her, were sworn to silence about the Queen's private life. One of them, Blanche Parry, served Elizabeth for over 50 years. She was trusted, loyal, and, crucially, discreet. But even Blanche was rumored to have kept journals about the Queen's habits and moods. Those notes never surfaced. Of course, they disappeared, as many inconvenient records did, shortly after Blanche's death. Life was small, but not joyless. It had rhythm, texture, and laughter, sometimes at their own expense, sometimes at the absurdities of their social betters. Because even peasants knew nobility might have castles, but they also had gout, arranged marriages, and inbreeding. In the long run, it was hard to say who had more fun. Let's drift now, from the quiet laughter of the village fire to the larger rhythms of the medieval year. Harvest festivals, saints' days, and strange rituals that blended faith and folly. Because the peasant's idea of fun wasn't just about play, it was about marking time in a world that didn't have clocks. In another case, a young woman vanished from her English village. Years later, a nun in France confessed to being her. She'd run away to escape an arranged marriage. Now, of course, not all inquisitors were entirely heartless. Some believed, earnestly, painfully, that they were saving souls. Take Bernard Guy, the infamous inquisitor from the early 14th century, in The Name of the Rose. Guy's actual writings reveal a methodical man, almost bureaucratically gentle in his reasoning. Because some secrets don't get passed down. They get buried. Then there were the servants who weren't just silent observers, but active conspirators. A royal household, after all, was the perfect setting for betrayal. Palaces had endless corridors, private doors, and servants who could move unseen. In 14th century England, Edward II learned this painfully well. Edward was an unpopular king with unpopular favorites. When he was eventually captured and imprisoned, it was his keepers, royal servants themselves, who oversaw his final moments. The story of his death, involving a red-hot poker, is almost certainly exaggerated. But the grim truth remains. It was servants, not soldiers, who carried it out. The same hands that once served him dinner became his executioners. That was the strange duality of royal service. One day polishing a crown, the next day burying the head that wore it. And then there were those who simply vanished. When monarchs fell, their households often fell with them. After Marie Antoinette was imprisoned, most of her servants were dismissed, imprisoned, or quietly disappeared. One maid, Madame Campan, managed to survive, but only by reinventing herself as a teacher and never speaking publicly about what she'd seen. She wrote her memoirs years later, careful to sound respectful, restrained, and only mildly traumatized. She described the Queen's final days with weary affection, noting how the same courtiers who once bowed at her feet couldn't be found anywhere. Servants, though, stayed longer than most. They always did. They were the last witnesses to fading grandeur, the quiet keepers of endings. In truth, royal servants were history's forgotten observers. They saw kings at their weakest, queens at their cruelest, and empires at their messiest. Their names rarely appear in chronicles, but their presence lingers between the lines, in rumors, letters, and half-erased confessions. Some were executed, some escaped, some simply faded into the tapestry of time, carrying secrets they never dared to tell. Because in every golden court, beneath every silk canopy, there was always someone sweeping nearby, pretending not to hear. And perhaps that's the most medieval thing of all, a world where the people who knew the most were the ones allowed to say the least. As the candles in our little imagined hall burn low, let's drift now toward another royal absurdity. The ones who weren't servants, but acted like them anyway. Princes, queens, and courtiers who devoted their lives to being useful in the most useless ways possible. A widow's work is never done. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, that faintly damp, faintly miserable stretch of history where castles were cold, grief was public, and the dead didn't always stay in one piece. If you've ever wondered what a medieval widow did after her husband died, beyond the obvious weeping, fainting, and vowing never to remarry until next Tuesday, this is for you. Because in medieval Europe, death wasn't a clean break. It was a process, a slow, bureaucratic, sometimes gruesome performance of devotion. And for noble women, that performance could last years, or in some cases, involve physically transporting parts of their late husband's anatomy across the continent. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift gently through the quiet, candle-lit corridors of widowhood, where love, politics, and decomposition met in the most dignified way possible. Let's start with something simple. The basic question of what, exactly, a widow was supposed to do after her husband died. Today, you might call a lawyer, order some flowers, maybe post something tasteful on social media. In the 13th century, however, things were a little more administrative. When a nobleman died, his wife's life didn't stop. It rearranged. She suddenly became a dowager, a term that comes from dower, meaning the property she was allowed to keep after her husband's death. This was often a specific set of lands, chosen carefully to give her income, but not too much independence. It was also, rather ironically, one of the few times in her life she had legal control over her own affairs. Medieval marriage law essentially treated women like honorary furniture, but widows were useful. They could manage estates, arrange alliances, and, crucially, remarry to someone politically convenient. So, while the body was cooling, the paperwork was heating up. But before any of that, there was the funeral, and medieval funerals were not delicate affairs. Imagine the castle courtyard, the smell of incense failing to disguise the smell of everything else, monks chanting in a minor key, servants wringing their hands theatrically. Somewhere, a falcon cries, because of course it does. The widow was expected to be the picture of holy sorrow, silent, composed, draped in black or gray wool. Ideally, she fainted at least once during the ceremony, but not so dramatically that anyone suspected performance. This was not just personal grief. It was social theater. Every tear was a political signal. Because in the Middle Ages, death was never private. It was the ultimate public event, meant to display the family's power, wealth, and, ideally, piety. Coffins were expensive, candles were imported, and the number of monks chanting at your funeral could easily be mistaken for a popularity contest. And at the center of all of it stood the widow, who had one very specific job: to embody sorrow so convincingly that no one questioned her right to her late husband's lands. Now, medieval people didn't just bury people, they prepared them. This meant the body. And in wealthier circles, that meant embalming. It was a complicated, messy process involving herbs, wine, and whatever vaguely antiseptic substance could be found in the 14th century. The goal wasn't preservation so much as delay. The delay was important, because many noble bodies had to travel, sometimes hundreds of miles, from where they died to where they were supposed to be buried. Kings and crusaders tended to die inconveniently far from home, often in places that lacked reliable refrigeration, and so began the strange medieval practice known as the division of the body. That's right. Sometimes they took the husband apart, not metaphorically. Literally, there were three main options for body division, which in true medieval fashion sound like something out of a Gothic cookbook. The first was Mos Teutonicus, or the German method. This involved boiling the body in wine, water, or vinegar until the flesh separated cleanly from the bones. The soft parts were buried locally, usually in holy ground, and the bones were cleaned, perfumed, and sent home in a chest. Perfectly practical. Perfectly horrifying. This was how the body of Saint Louis IX of France was returned home from the Crusades. It was also done for many knights who died abroad, men whose widows were left waiting anxiously for what must have been the worst delivery in history. The second option was heart burial, which became oddly fashionable in the 12th and 13th centuries. A nobleman's heart, often seen as the seat of courage and faith, could be removed and buried separately, sometimes with his widow, sometimes in a church he particularly liked. It was sentimental in theory, but occasionally derailed by logistics. The heart had to be cleaned, dried, and sealed in wax or lead. Occasionally, it was placed in a silver reliquary shaped like a heart. Romantic? Perhaps. Hygienic? Absolutely not. The third method was less refined. Simple dismemberment for convenience. Sometimes, if a widow couldn't afford a grand transport, or if the body had begun to, let's say, make its presence known, the remains were buried in parts across multiple locations. This wasn't just macabre. It was symbolic. A man's loyalty could be split among his lands, his church, and his family. A few widows even took advantage of this practice to make a quiet statement, ensuring their husband's heart rested near them, while the rest of him was politely deposited somewhere politically strategic. It was grief with paperwork. One of the more famous examples comes from Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward IV of England. When she died in 1290, Edward was devastated, which, for him, was saying something. He ordered her body transported from Lincoln to Westminster Abbey, and at every stop along the way, he built a stone cross, the famous Eleanor crosses. But before all that, Eleanor's own heart was removed and buried separately. As was customary, Edward kept her body close for the long procession, a journey that took 12 days and a great deal of logistics, and he reportedly never remarried for years afterward. It was an unusual show of tenderness for a king, known more for conquering Wales than for emotional expression. Widows, however, often faced a more practical problem: what to do when the husband's remains arrived home. The burial location mattered immensely. A nobleman's final resting place wasn't just about piety, it was about politics. Burying him at a major monastery could ensure prayers for his soul. Burying him on family lands could cement his dynasty's local claim. And so the widow had to choose. Sometimes she honored his wishes. Sometimes she ignored them. Sometimes she even buried him in multiple locations just to appease everyone. A sort of medieval compromise between faith and feudal squabbling. There are records of widows transporting bodies by river, by cart, and once, quite memorably, by wine barrel. Apparently, it masked the smell and prevented questions, which says a lot about the Middle Ages. Now, not all widows handled grief the same way. Some were paragons of pious mourning. Others were a little more pragmatic. Take Isabella of Angoulême, widow of King John of England, the famously unpopular monarch who gave the world the Magna Carta and not much else. After his death in 1216, Isabella dutifully attended his funeral and shed all the necessary tears. Then she returned to France, reclaimed her lands, and promptly married a much younger nobleman. It was technically scandalous, but strategically brilliant. She protected her inheritance and regained independence. The church was scandalized, naturally, but Isabella didn't care. She'd spent years enduring her husband's temper, his political disasters, and his particularly medieval dental hygiene. A second marriage to a charming young count must have felt like winning the lottery. Other widows took a different path, retreating into religious life. This was both expected and useful. By entering a convent, a noble widow could avoid remarriage and devote her life and her income to prayer. It also kept her conveniently out of the way, which kings and heirs found reassuring. But not all were sincere. Some widows joined convents temporarily, then left when politics changed. A few used their new religious status as a cover for running estates from behind the cloister walls. Multitasking, medieval style. The line between devotion and property management was often blurry. Of course, there were also the legendary widows, women who built entire cults of mourning around themselves. The most dramatic of these was Joan, Countess of Kent, sometimes called the Fair Maid of Kent. When her first husband died in 1352, Joan commissioned an elaborate tomb, wore black for years, and insisted on being buried beside him, until, naturally, she fell in love with Edward the Black Prince. She married him secretly, creating one of the great scandals of Edward III's court. Apparently, her grief had an expiration date. Widowhood in the Middle Ages was, above all, performative. There was genuine loss, yes, but it was wrapped in ritual, costume, and expectation. A noble widow's behavior after her husband's death could shape her reputation for decades. Too cheerful, and she was heartless. Too somber, and she was politically useless. Too eager to remarry, and she was indecent. And so many walked a delicate line, mourning publicly while quietly negotiating their next alliance. But before we drift further into the politics of grief, let's pause on something softer. Because amid all this ritual and politics, there were moments of sincerity. The first time we met. Death. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before tombs, before coffins, before the polite silence of modern funerals, to a world where the first humans met death face to face, and didn't quite know what to do about it. So, if you're lying in bed right now, maybe with the light dimmed and a cup of tea growing cold beside you, let's drift back together to a small clearing somewhere in the Pleistocene. A world of flickering firelight, heavy animal skin tents, and the faint sound of wind over grass that hasn't yet been domesticated into farmland. Somewhere out there, a human, or something very much like one, has just stopped breathing, and someone else is standing over them, blinking slowly, wondering why the body that was warm and loud a moment ago is now still, cold, and strangely heavy. Because, and this is one of those quietly astonishing things, there was a first time someone realized that death happens. And for a while, no one quite knew what to do with that realization. The earliest dead. When curiosity met confusion, archaeologists can't tell us who the first corpse viewers were, but we can piece together little clues. Bones, tools, and traces of sentiment, to imagine how that first encounter with mortality might have looked. Early humans and our cousins, like Neanderthals and Homo naledi, sometimes buried their dead, and sometimes didn't. Sometimes they placed flowers, tools, or pigments near the bodies, and sometimes, rather awkwardly, they seem to have eaten them. Anthropology, as always, is full of charming contradictions. Imagine a small family of hunter-gatherers huddled inside a cave at dusk. Someone has died. Maybe from a fall. Maybe from infection. There's no priest, no doctor, no sense of funeral, just a still body, and a growing sense that it isn't quite right to leave it lying there. The others might have touched the skin, puzzled at its cooling. They might have called the person's name or nudged the shoulder, as if expecting them to wake up. And when that didn't happen, they might have done what humans still do when faced with something we don't understand. Tried to make it mean something. They covered the body with earth, or stones, perhaps to keep animals away, or perhaps because they sensed it was somehow sacred. The line between sanitation and superstition was very thin back then. The oldest funerals, sort of. The oldest confirmed burial so far, and there's always debate about this, comes from a site in Israel called Kafze Cave, where early Homo sapiens buried a young man and child about 100,000 years ago. They were laid carefully in shallow graves, with red ochre pigment sprinkled nearby, which means, at the very least, someone cared enough to make it look nice. Now, red ochre is an iron oxide pigment. It's been used in art, ritual, and, confusingly, as a kind of ancient skin care. But in this case, it probably meant blood, or life, a symbolic way of saying, this person is gone, but something of them remains. And that's the start of a pattern we still follow. When faced with death, humans decorate it. We can't stop ourselves. We drape it, perfume it, paint it. It's as if we're saying to the universe, yes, we know this is horrifying, but at least we can make it aesthetically coherent. In another cave, Shanidar, in what's now Iraqi Kurdistan, Neanderthals seem to have buried their dead with flowers. Some pollen grains were found around a skeleton there, suggesting they placed blooms on the body. Of course, it's possible the flowers just fell in later, or were dropped by some pollen-loving rodent. But most researchers like the romantic version better. And honestly, so do I. Picture it. A dim cave, flickering torchlight, a cluster of shaggy, heavy-browed Neanderthals laying wildflowers on the chest of their companion. It's a strangely gentle image, and proof that the impulse to mourn isn't a modern invention. Before, grief had a script. It's hard to imagine now. But there was a time when grief had no etiquette. No black veils, no dirges, no formal processions. People simply felt something. Confusion, loss, maybe fear. And then improvised. For early humans, death was both fascinating and terrifying. Sometimes the dead were buried with care. Other times they were left exposed to the elements. In some cases, skulls were kept, perhaps as keepsakes, perhaps as a form of ancestor worship, or perhaps because someone decided it made for interesting decor. In Jericho, around 9,000 years ago, archaeologists found human skulls with plaster molded over them and seashells set in the eye sockets. Basically, early humanity's first attempt at realistic wax figures, except made from actual relatives. It was affectionate in a deeply unsettling way. These plastered skulls were likely placed in homes, maybe even in shrines, to represent beloved ancestors watching over the living. And while that sounds creepy to modern ears, it's also kind of sweet. A literal attempt to keep loved ones close. So, to answer the question, when people first saw a corpse, they didn't always recoil in horror. Sometimes they tried to bring it back. Symbolically, artistically, even spiritually, through ritual and decoration. The moment death became dirty for a long time, death wasn't dirty. It was natural, neutral, part of the landscape. You died, you decayed, something else ate you. Fair enough. But once agriculture arrived and villages became permanent, the corpse stopped being a curiosity and started being a problem. Imagine early farmers in Mesopotamia, living in dense little clusters of mud brick houses. Now imagine one of them dies in midsummer, and everyone's still figuring out plumbing. Suddenly, just leave him over there is not a viable plan. So the first practical reactions to seeing a corpse were less about metaphysics and more about pest control. Burials became more structured, not because of belief, but because of smell. Over time, that necessity turned into ritual. Burying the dead became associated with cleanliness, respect, and divine order. We started assigning roles. Mourners, priests, grave diggers, and just like that, grief became a profession. When death became a social event, by the time we reach ancient Egypt, death isn't just a fact of life, it's a full-blown industry. The Egyptians took one look at mortality and said, "Ah, yes, let's make this everyone's business." They turned death into an art form, meticulously preserving the body through mummification. They drained, dried, anointed, and wrapped it, then tucked it away with jewelry, linen, food, and occasionally a few unlucky servants. What's interesting is that the Egyptians didn't fear corpses. They collaborated with them. They believed that preserving the body helped the soul recognize its earthly form in the afterlife. To them, a corpse wasn't gross. It was simply waiting for better times, which, depending on your view of the afterlife, is either comforting or deeply impractical. Of course, for most ordinary Egyptians, funerals were less glamorous. The peasants didn't get gilded sarcophagi or pyramids. They got sand, quick, efficient, and, conveniently, a natural desiccant. Even so, the principle remained. The dead were still part of things. They weren't hidden away. They were neighbors, literally buried under your feet. Greek opinions. Equal parts respect and anxiety. When we drift over to ancient Greece, death starts to get complicated. The Greeks had a kind of uneasy respect for the dead. They didn't fear the body itself, but they did fear the spirit lingering nearby, especially if the burial wasn't done properly. To die without a proper funeral was almost a curse. That's why the myth of Antigone, the woman who risked her life to bury her brother, hit such a cultural nerve. Leaving a body unburied wasn't just cruel, it was spiritually dangerous. Greek funerals involved washing the corpse, anointing it with oil, and wrapping it in fine linen. Women, usually relatives, led the laments, crying and tearing their hair in a ritualized performance of grief. Because, of course, they did. No one ever accused ancient Greece of emotional restraint. But here's the thing. For all their philosophy and refinement, the Greeks were quietly terrified of contamination. They wouldn't touch a dead body unless they had to. Priests, for example, were forbidden to go near corpses at all. Death was considered ritually polluting. So while philosophers pondered the nature of the soul, the average Athenian was mostly thinking, how soon can we wash our hands? The Romans, equal parts practical and pompous. The Romans, naturally, made death political. Funerals were public theater, part grief, part social networking opportunity. If you were wealthy, your funeral procession would be long, loud, and designed to impress the neighbors. Professional mourners were hired to wail dramatically, while actors wore wax masks of your ancestors' faces. It was like an early version of family legacy content. Bodies were laid out in the atrium of the home for viewing before cremation. People would come to pay their respects, which, as always, meant also judging the decor. Cremation was the norm. though burial regained popularity later, partly because early Christians preferred it, and partly because Rome ran out of wood. What's interesting is how unflustered the Romans were by corpses. They were familiar with death, from war, plague, childbirth, or gladiatorial games. It was everywhere, so they developed a kind of brisk efficiency about it. But even they had limits. Corpses weren't allowed inside the city walls, hence the famous Via Appia, lined with tombs just outside the urban boundary. You could be remembered, but not smelled. What happened to the children of heretics and witches? Hey, everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the quieter corners of history, the kind filled not with kings or knights, but with children who just happened to be born into the wrong families. So, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe let a candle flicker for atmosphere. And let's wander together through the slower, sadder lanes of medieval Europe, where guilt could be inherited like a surname, and the sins of the parents were rarely forgiven by the living. This is the story of the children of heretics and witches, those small, nameless souls who grew up under the long shadow of someone else's pyre. The problem of inheritance, of a sort. The Middle Ages loved order. Everyone had their place. Nobles, peasants, priests, even lepers, each neatly stacked in the divine filing system of society. But there was one group the Church never quite knew what to do with: the children of the condemned. If your parent was burned for heresy, hanged for witchcraft, or excommunicated for some form of creative theology, then you unfortunately became an administrative inconvenience. The medieval mind had a deep belief that sin was contagious, like a spiritual illness that could pass through bloodlines. So if your mother had danced with the devil, it stood to reason you might grow up to take waltz lessons from him. Of course, it didn't help that many of these children were suddenly very poor. Once a person was declared a heretic, their property was seized by the church or the crown, which meant their families lost everything. Homes, lands, heirlooms, all gone overnight. So even if the authorities didn't actively punish the children, they didn't really need to. Poverty, hunger, and social exile tended to finish the job. A little family example. The Cathars. Let's drift for a moment to southern France, in the early 13th century. The sun is warm, the olive trees are whispering, and the local population has accidentally invented a heresy. They were called Cathars, a religious movement that believed the material world was evil and corrupt. A bold opinion, considering they lived in it. They thought the body was a prison, and only the soul was pure, which, as you can imagine, didn't go down terribly well with the Catholic Church. The Pope declared a crusade against them, the Albigensian Crusade, and the result was predictably unpleasant. Entire towns were wiped out, whole families were burned, and the survivors, including the children, were left to wander the ruins of their faith. The Church faced a small moral dilemma: what to do with the children of heretics. On one hand, they were innocent. On the other, they were terrifyingly related to people who'd just been branded as spiritual poison. The solution was simple and grimly logical. Take the children away. Raise them in monasteries or convents. Teach them proper doctrine, and hope the heresy washed off by adulthood. It was a kind of medieval re-education program, complete with psalms and cold stone floors. Some children were genuinely absorbed into the church, brought up to become devout priests or nuns. Others, less fortunate, became servants in religious houses, permanent reminders that holiness required humility, and, preferably, someone else doing the laundry. When your parent was a witch by the 15th century, Europe had largely shifted its moral panic from heretics to witches. The Church had discovered, with some enthusiasm, that not only were there false believers, there were also women who apparently held nighttime Sabbaths with the devil, caused storms, spoiled milk, and occasionally turned into goats. This was not great news, if your mother happened to be one of them. Witch trials often involved entire families. If a woman was accused, her husband, sisters, or children were usually dragged in for questioning. Authorities believed witchcraft was taught, like a household trade, which, in a sense, it was, if you count midwifery, herbalism, and general competence. Children were questioned about their parents, sometimes under torture, sometimes under the far subtler pressure of leading questions. It was not unusual for a frightened child to confess that their mother had taken them flying on a broomstick, or fed them strange food at night. And because confession was the one form of evidence that medieval courts adored, that was usually enough. The child's testimony condemned the parent. The parent's death condemned the child. And the cycle of loss turned quietly on. After the fire, once the execution was over, the children were left behind. They were often destitute, their property confiscated, their family names spat out in the street. Some communities took pity on them, others avoided them like a bad omen. There's a record from Germany in 1628 of a young girl whose mother was burned as a witch. The Townsfolk refused to let her live in the village afterward, fearing she carried her mother's curse. She survived for a while by begging, until, inevitably, she disappeared from the records. Others were placed in orphanages, usually church-run, where the main educational goal was to unteach everything they'd learned at home. They were taught prayers, obedience, and silence. The church couldn't risk a new generation of heretics or witches. Better to make them saints through structure. And so the children of the condemned were washed in Scripture, scrubbed of memory, and told never to ask questions. The bureaucracy of guilt, it might comfort you to know that even medieval bureaucracy found this whole situation uncomfortable. There were actual debates about it. In the 14th century, theologians asked, should a heretic's children inherit their lands? Could they be ordained as priests? Did the sin of the father flow through the bloodline? The answers, predictably, varied by how generous the church was feeling that decade. In theory, children were not legally responsible for their parents' crimes. In practice, everyone quietly agreed they probably were. A decree from Pope Innocent III, who, despite the name, was not particularly innocent, declared that children of heretics could not inherit property unless they had publicly renounced their parents' beliefs, which was awkward if your parents were dead, and the beliefs in question were largely speculative. It created a kind of moral paperwork. Before you could receive your father's fields, you had to denounce him first, a medieval version of click accept to continue. The heretic's son who survived. Let's drift to a specific case. The year is 1415, and Jan Hus, a Czech reformer, one of the early voices criticizing church corruption, is being burned at the stake. His crime, believing that priests should live modestly, and that indulgences were a scam. He was right, of course, but that didn't help. Huss died for his ideas and his followers. The Hussites were hunted for decades afterward. Many of their children grew up in secret, raised by sympathetic relatives or hiding in the hills. They carried their parents' beliefs quietly, like an heirloom they couldn't display. Over time, those hidden children became the next generation of reformers. You could say Protestantism was built, in part by orphans of earlier burnings. So even when the church tried to extinguish heresy, the ashes had a way of settling into the soil. Across the sea, the Puritan twist even. When Europe's witch trials finally began to cool, the New World kept the fire going. Sometimes, literally. In Puritan New England, witchcraft accusations often left children in the same familiar ruin. During the Salem witch trials of 1692, some of the accused women were mothers, Their children were imprisoned alongside them. Infants born in cells, toddlers crying through interrogations. When the trials finally collapsed under their own absurdity, some of those children were left orphaned. Their families had been executed, their property confiscated, and their names forever stained. The colony offered no reparations. For decades afterward, the children of Salem's witches lived under a cloud of suspicion, whispered about, avoided, and quietly reminded that forgiveness had an expiration date. When the state replaced the church as Europe moved into the Enlightenment, and reason began to awkwardly shuffle into the room, you might think the persecution of the innocent stopped. But it didn't. It just got more organized. In Catholic Spain, for example, the Inquisition kept detailed records, meticulous, chillingly polite paperwork on every person convicted of heresy. Those records didn't die with the accused. They followed the family for generations. If your great-grandfather had been tried for heresy, you might find it difficult to enter certain professions, or to marry into respectable families. The stigma lingered like smoke. It wasn't until the 18th century that the idea of individual guilt really began to take hold in law. Before then, your lineage was your resume and your ruin. A quiet inheritance so. What happened to the children of heretics and witches? Most of them disappeared. Not dramatically, just softly, into anonymity. They became servants, monks, farmers. They married quietly, renamed themselves, and let the centuries forget. A few, ironically, ended up working for the same church that killed their parents, because really, what else was there to do? And some of them, especially in the Reformation era, turned their inherited grief into reform. The memory of burned parents became a quiet fuel for questioning authority. You can still trace those lines if you look closely. The descendants of the punished, turning the old pyres into pulpits. Let's drift to a pause here. What daily life looked like in orphanages and convents, how superstition shaped their upbringing and the small. A crown and a schedule. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of candles and cold stone, where every room smelled faintly of beeswax, smoke, and damp wool, where queens wore velvet and gold thread, but still had to worry about drafty corridors and unheated rooms. We're going to wander quietly through the daily life of a medieval queen. Not the storybook kind. Not the ones sweeping into ballrooms or commanding glittering armies, but the real women who woke up each morning under a pile of fur blankets, surrounded by servants, prayers, and a mild sense of political dread. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights, and let's drift back to the Middle Ages to find out what a queen actually did all day. We should start with the obvious. Being a medieval queen was, technically, a job, a strange one. A lifetime appointment with no clear job description, no weekends off, and constant risk of being blamed for the weather, plagues, or your husband's bad temper. Your main duties? To look regal, to produce heirs, and to not start wars accidentally. It sounds simple enough, until you remember that most queens were married off before they could even read. Take, for example, Eleanor of Provence, who became Queen of England in the 13th century. She arrived from sunny southern France at just 12 years old. Small, elegant, and very confused. England, as it turned out, was cold, muddy, and full of people who disliked her accent. She barely spoke English, but was expected to charm nobles twice her age, manage a royal household, and eventually provide a son. So, from dawn to dusk, her life was carefully choreographed. A kind of living theater, where she was always on stage, always observed, and never quite free. Mornings began early, usually around sunrise, when the chapel bells rang through the corridors. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting would enter quietly, carrying candles and murmuring, "Benedicite," a gentle good morning. Her bed was likely surrounded by heavy curtains, both for warmth and privacy. Inside, it was lined with linen sheets, stuffed mattresses, and fur blankets, the medieval version of central heating. But she didn't just get up and stretch like a normal person. No, waking up was a whole process. First, the Queen would be blessed by her chaplain. Then, servants would help her wash with warm water, scented if possible, rose water, or herbs steeped overnight. And then came the dressing. Layers upon layers. A linen shift, a silk gown, a surcoat, and sometimes a fur mantle. Jewels for state days, or simpler ribbons for quieter mornings. It was like assembling armor, except the battle was court life. By mid-morning, it was time for Mass. Attendance wasn't optional. Piety was a performance. Queens were expected to model virtue, to be seen praying, ideally looking serene and mildly radiant. This wasn't private devotion. It was public theater. Every sigh, every whispered "Amen" was part of a carefully maintained reputation. Courtier, visibly devout queen, could make her husband look more legitimate, a visibly bored one. could cause a scandal. Some queens used this time strategically. Catherine of Aragon, for instance, used her daily chapel appearances to remind everyone that she, the Spanish princess, was the very image of pious endurance, especially useful while Henry VIII was chasing Anne Boleyn around the corridors. So, yes, Mass was spiritual, but also political. After prayers came the business of the morning. Queens were technically not supposed to govern, but in practice many did. The king was often away hunting, warring, or sulking, and someone had to sign documents, hear petitions, and keep the household from descending into chaos. In some courts, queens held their own small councils, groups of ladies, clerks and stewards who managed estates, charities, and correspondence. Eleanor of Aquitaine was particularly good at this. When her husband, King Henry II, was off crusading or, well, being difficult, she ruled entire regions of France on her own. She read petitions, issued orders, and managed finances, all while maintaining the image of a mild, dutiful wife. It's the medieval equivalent of saying, "Oh, it's fine. I'm just holding the entire country together while he's out jousting." Speaking of paperwork, the Queen's household was enormous. Depending on her rank and wealth, she might oversee anywhere from 50 to 300 servants. There were cooks, maids, falconers, jesters, scribes, grooms, and musicians. And of course, the ladies-in-waiting, noblewomen who lived with the Queen as companions, confidantes, and sometimes spies. The Queen didn't handle every detail personally, but she was expected to set the tone. Her manners became the court's manners. Her fashion became the standard. If she smiled at someone, their career might flourish. If she frowned, well, they might suddenly find themselves reassigned to a damp castle in Wales, so even lunch was political. Chata toyonsit. Let's talk about that lunch. Meals were events. A queen never ate alone, not because she wanted company, but because it wasn't considered safe or appropriate. Every bite of food had to be witnessed, blessed, and, ideally, tasted by someone else first. There was always the fear of poison, or, more often, gossip. So, around midday, the Queen would sit at a raised table, not grand enough to be mistaken for a royal feast, but dignified. Her attendants would stand in neat rows, pretending not to notice that she'd probably had the same boiled fish for 3 days straight. Bread, cheese, roasted meat, fruit if it was in season, wine diluted with water, because, oddly enough, hydration wasn't invented yet. Conversations were light, polite, and utterly exhausting Every joke was political. Every silence was suspicious. If you sneezed at the wrong moment, someone might interpret it as an insult to the king. After lunch came what we'd call the quiet hours. For queens, this was the least unpleasant part of the day. She might walk in the gardens, heavily escorted. Of course, she might sit in her private chambers, embroidering or reading aloud with her. Ladies, embroidery wasn't just decoration. It was also diplomacy, a way to send subtle messages through imagery and color. Margaret of Anjou famously embroidered hawks attacking smaller birds, a delicately violent metaphor for her political ambitions, because, of course, even her needlework was strategic. For other queens, embroidery was a way to cope. Isabella of France, wife of the perpetually unfaithful Edward II, reportedly spent long hours sewing devotional cloths. Some say it was penance. Others think it was the medieval version of stress knitting. Evenings were more public again. The court gathered for supper, smaller than the king's, but still full of ceremony. Minstrels sang, servants bustled, and everyone pretended to enjoy the boiled vegetables. Afterwards came music, poetry, or games. Queens often presided over this like a weary hostess at an eternal party. It was her duty to keep the court cheerful, to nod approvingly at songs, and to laugh quietly at jokes about peasants. But there was no such thing as relaxing. Every gesture was watched. Every word could travel across Europe by morning. You can imagine the exhaustion. To be endlessly gracious, endlessly poised, endlessly aware that your entire existence was a public performance. And then, finally, night. Her servants would undress her layer by layer, like unwrapping a gilded onion. The gown would be hung in cedar chests, the jewels locked away. Her hair would be brushed and braided. And then she'd be left alone in theory. Except, of course, she wasn't. If she was of childbearing age, there was always the question of the king's visit. Sometimes it was scheduled. Sometimes it was a surprise. Sometimes it didn't happen at all. And then she'd have to field rumors about infertility, divine punishment, or witchcraft, because nothing says romantic like being publicly blamed for the lack of an heir. Motherhood was the one area where queens had some real importance, but almost no control. Their children were raised by nurses, tutors, and courtiers. Even in infancy, a royal baby belonged more to the dynasty than to its mother. Queens could be forbidden from breastfeeding their own infant. What did medieval people do when they lost their minds? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world that didn't have therapists, medications, or mindfulness apps. A world where losing your mind wasn't something you treated. It was something that happened to you, like bad weather or divine punishment. So, tuck yourself in, dim the lights, and let's wander softly into the slow, uneasy rhythms of the Middle Ages, when madness was a mystery, saints were psychiatrists, and the cure for melancholy might involve being bled, prayed over, or quietly locked in a tower until further notice. Because tonight, we're exploring what happened when medieval people lost their minds. Mental illness, though no one would have called it that yet, was an accepted part of life. After all, everyone knew someone who talked to themselves, or stared at walls for hours, or believed they were possessed by invisible spirits. The difference is that back then, people didn't say, "He's having a breakdown." They said things like, "God has touched him," or, more ominously, "The devil has." And, depending on who you were, that distinction could determine whether you were cared for or condemned. Let's start gently with the early medieval period. Back then, the human mind was not thought to be a biological thing. It was a battlefield between God and Satan. Your thoughts, your dreams, your impulses, they weren't yours, not really. They were whispers from somewhere else, which meant that when someone began acting strange, laughing uncontrollably, trembling, hearing voices, or wandering naked through the fields, their neighbors didn't think mental illness. They thought possession, and the go-to solution for possession was prayer, or, failing that, exorcism. Now, exorcism in the Middle Ages wasn't the Hollywood kind with spinning heads and flying furniture. It was a slow, mostly tedious affair involving holy water, chanting, and occasionally holding someone down while a priest tried to reason with a demon, which, as you can imagine, was about as effective as it sounds. If you were lucky, someone might take pity on you and bring you to a monastery. Monks were the closest thing medieval Europe had to mental health professionals. They couldn't diagnose schizophrenia, but they did believe in the healing power of silence, gardens, and repetitive labor. You might be given simple food, quiet surroundings, and a chance to find balance. Or, if that didn't work, they might just confine you in a cell for your own good and for everyone else's peace of mind. There are records of these so-called mad cells in monasteries across England and France, small windowless rooms meant to contain a single person. They weren't necessarily cruel, more like a combination of a cell and a sick room. You might be prayed over, you might be ignored. Either way, you'd spend a lot of time alone. The underlying philosophy was this: madness wasn't random. It was moral, something you'd brought upon yourself through sin, indulgence, or the devil's influence, which made recovery not a matter of medicine, but repentance. Of course, things got a little more complicated when the mad person in question wasn't a peasant or a beggar, but someone with a title, because if you were a noble, you couldn't simply be declared possessed. That would imply your entire bloodline was touched by evil, which, in royal politics, was inconvenient. So instead, your madness would be renamed. You weren't insane. You were melancholic, or ill with humors, or perhaps just withdrawn, which was the polite medieval way of saying completely unhinged. Take Charles VI of France. For example, Charles ruled in the late 14th century, a time when the French monarchy was not doing great, and, to be fair, Charles himself was not doing great either. He was charming, intelligent, and popular, until one summer day when he suddenly decided to murder his own knights. He'd been riding with his retinue through a forest when, mid-ride, he froze, drew his sword, and began attacking everyone around him. He was eventually restrained, trembling and foaming at the mouth, then slipped into a coma for several days. When he awoke, he didn't remember a thing. This was only the beginning. Over the following years, Charles would suffer repeated mental collapses. Sometimes he refused to let anyone touch him. Sometimes he forgot he was king. And sometimes he believed he was made of glass, a surprisingly common delusion in medieval Europe, probably because glass was both precious and fragile. To prevent himself from shattering, Charles ordered iron rods sewn into his clothing and refused to let anyone come near him. His court physicians, being medieval, diagnosed this as a disturbance of the humors, those imaginary fluids thought to control every aspect of your body and mind. The cure? Well, they tried purging. They tried bleeding. They tried herbal concoctions with names like Saint Dymphna's cordial, which, depending on who you asked, could either calm the mind or induce vomiting. Nothing worked, so Charles's council decided the next best thing was to simply hide him. For long stretches, the king was confined to a private palace, where attendants tended to him quietly, while the government ran itself into the ground. Whenever he was lucid, they'd bring him out for appearances. When he wasn't, he'd disappear again. No explanations necessary, because nothing says stable monarchy like a king who thinks he's transparent. But Charles VI wasn't alone. His English counterpart, Henry VI, suffered from something strikingly similar. Henry was the son of Henry V, the great warrior king of Agincourt, which meant expectations were high. Unfortunately, Henry VI was the polar opposite of his father. Quiet, pious, and fragile, He was described as a lamb among wolves, and eventually the lamb snapped. One day, he simply stopped speaking, stopped reacting, sat still for months on end, staring at nothing. He didn't recognize his own wife. When presented with his newborn son, he said nothing. The English court, alarmed but pragmatic, decided to pretend everything was fine, because acknowledging that the king was catatonic wasn't good politics. Eventually, Henry recovered, but the damage was done. His strange episodes, combined with a disastrous marriage and a few rebellions, led to the Wars of the Roses. So, in a way, an untreated mental illness helped plunge England into decades of civil war, which is quite an outcome for one man's nervous breakdown. But what about those outside the royal circle, the ordinary people who lost their minds? Well, for most of them, there was no treatment at all. You might be cared for by family if they could afford it, or you might be turned loose to wander. Every town had its share of holy fools or village idiots. People tolerated on the edges of society, sometimes pitied, sometimes mocked, but rarely institutionalized. In fact, confinement for the insane didn't become widespread until the Renaissance, when cities began building hospitals specifically for the mad. And by hospitals, I mean asylums, which naturally made things worse. Let's drift over to London. In the year 1403, there stood the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, known to history simply as Bedlam. Originally a religious house, Bedlam gradually evolved into a place for those deemed too disturbed to live in society. There were no doctors in the modern sense. The treatment was mostly confinement, prayer, and the occasional beating to bring the mind back to reason. Visitors were even allowed to come in and watch, for a small fee, because of course they were. The insane became a kind of grim entertainment, a living warning of what happens when you stray too far from God's path, or, in practice, from acceptable behavior. Still, it wasn't all cruelty. Some medieval people believed madness could also be holy. The Fool for Christ tradition in Eastern Europe saw madness as divine. Those who behaved erratically might be revered, not restrained, because maybe they saw something others couldn't. In Western Europe, too, saints like Dymphna, Christina the Astonishing, and Margaret of Cortona were associated with mental suffering. Dymphna, in particular, became the unofficial patron saint of the mentally ill. According to legend, she fled her father's castle after he developed an unsettling romantic interest in her. When he found her, he beheaded her. The site of her death in modern Belgium became a healing shrine. Centuries later, pilgrims with mental afflictions would still travel there, hoping to be cured by her intercession. So, Yes, even in the bleakest times, there was compassion, and the faint sense that madness wasn't just sin or sickness, but something deeply human. Let's drift a bit further forward, toward the late Middle Ages. By then, European medicine had begun to rediscover the ancient Greek idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow. The hangman's house. Hey, everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a place no one really wanted to live. Somewhere just outside the city walls. A house that everyone knew and avoided, because this is where he lived. The executioner, the hangman, the man whose very job made him necessary, but untouchable. So, dim your lights. Let your breathing slow a little. We're about to slip quietly through the back gate of medieval Europe to visit the most unwanted family in town. The people who carried death on their shoulders like a family heirloom. If you were walking through a German town around the 15th century, you could often find the executioner's house by following the smell. Not because he was unclean, necessarily, but because of what he did for extra money. You see, being an executioner wasn't exactly a full-time gig, unless you lived in a particularly lively city, one that burned witches, tortured suspects, and hanged thieves on a regular schedule. You'd have long stretches of time without any official business. So, most executioners took on side jobs, and those jobs tended to be, let's say, in the same general neighborhood of horror. They cleaned cesspits. They disposed of animal carcasses. They skinned dead horses for leather, drained sewage, or collected the bodies of suicides floating in the river. If something was too filthy, too shameful, or too cursed for anyone else to touch, you called the hangman. It made sense. He was already unclean in the eyes of the town. Why not make it official? This idea of uncleanness went deep. In many medieval towns, executioners and their families weren't allowed to live within the city walls. Their homes stood just outside the gates, sometimes near the gallows hill, sometimes near the slaughterhouse, and often next to the tannery, because apparently one stench deserved another. Their children couldn't go to normal schools. Their wives couldn't bake bread for anyone but their own family. And if a daughter somehow caught the eye of a young man from town, well, that was the end of his social life. So the executioner's family became its own world. They intermarried with other executioner clans across regions, creating what historians sometimes call hangman dynasties. Families like the France family of Nuremberg, the Reindels of Augsburg, or the Roos of France, each passing the trade down from father to son for generations. It's a strange kind of nobility, isn't it? a dark mirror of the aristocracy, hereditary duty, a coat of arms of shame, and a lineage bound to service, only without the castles or the respect. Let's pause here. Imagine being a child in one of those families. You're 5 years old, running barefoot in the muddy yard behind the gallows. You can see the city walls just a few hundred feet away, the place where other children live, go to market, play in the churchyard, and yet you might never step inside. Your father's name is whispered. Your mother's hands are avoided. Your family is essential. And yet, you don't belong anywhere. In Nuremberg, there was a small wooden bridge that separated the hangman's house from the rest of the town. It became known as the Bridge of the EE. Damned. Not because of superstition, but because the hangman's children had to cross it to deliver medicine, bandages, and herbs to the town's poorer quarters. Ironically, the same people who feared them would also call on them for help, because, oddly enough, the executioner's family was often the cleanest and most medically skilled household in the area. You see, while the church considered them cursed, the hangman's family had access to something far more useful than holiness: experience. They understood anatomy. They knew which herbs slowed bleeding, which poultices drew out infection. They handled wounds, lanced boils, and even treated plague victims when no one else would dare approach. Some historians say that executioners were among the first proto-surgeons of medieval Europe, and they didn't get that knowledge from books. They learned it one body at a time, because an executioner's work didn't end when the head rolled. He had to clean up, had to handle bodies. He had to make sure the punishment looked proper, according to the local authorities. And yes, sometimes he even had to reassemble a botched beheading so that the condemned could die with dignity. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was technical, skilled, and over time, that skill turned into a kind of practical medicine, passed quietly from father to son, like a secret craft. Let's drift for a moment to 16th century Germany, where the most famous of these hangman surgeons lived. Franz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg. We know about him because, uniquely, he kept a diary. A calm, meticulous record of every execution he ever performed. Over the course of 45 years, he executed 394 people and flogged or maimed hundreds more. He wrote down every name, every crime, every method, and yet, between those chilling lines, something almost tender emerges. Schmidt also notes his medical work, the countless patients he treated, often for free. Dislocated limbs, ulcerated wounds, infections, tumors. By the time he retired, he had become one of the most respected healers in the region. When he finally received a pardon from the emperor, lifting the hereditary curse from his family, he used it to open a medical practice, and, in a strange and almost poetic twist, his children were finally free to live among the people their family had once served from exile. But that story is the exception, not the rule. For most executioner families, there was no imperial pardon. There was just the long, quiet life on the edge of town. Let's drift to France for a moment. In Paris, the official royal executioner's post was hereditary too, passed through the Sanson family for over 6 generations. They were wealthy by the 18th century. Respected, even, but still avoided. The most famous, Charles-Henri Sanson, would later execute King Louis XVI during the French Revolution. He was known as the Gentleman of the Place de la Révolution, but behind the formality, the Sansons carried the same burden. Isolation. Even with silk gloves and powdered wigs, they could never quite wash off the mark of their office. It clung to them like the scent of iron and smoke. There's something hauntingly consistent across centuries and countries. Executioners were needed, respected for their skill, but never accepted. They stood at a strange moral intersection between law and sin, justice and horror, and their families lived perpetually in that shadow. In some places, townspeople would avoid touching anything the hangman had touched. Coins he handled were considered cursed. His handshake was unthinkable. So how do you live when you can't touch or be touched? You turn inward. You build your own little world. Executioners' families often formed their own tiny social networks, marrying within the same profession across regions. A hangman's daughter might marry the son of a leper house keeper or a grave digger, occupations that shared a similar social status. Not quite outcasts, but close enough. They met each other at fairs, where their families were permitted to trade goods like leather, rope, and animal hides, products born of death and decay. You can almost imagine the awkward courtship conversations. So, what does your father do? He cleans plague pits. Ah, so you'll understand my work schedule. But for all the stigma, executioners weren't necessarily poor. Many were surprisingly well paid, sometimes as much as a minor noble or city official. In Nuremberg, Franz Schmidt earned a steady salary, along with free housing and regular bonuses. He could afford servants, good clothing, and a comfortable lifestyle. It's just that no one wanted to sit next to him at dinner. It's one of those strange medieval ironies. You could have money, status, even a letter of privilege from the emperor himself, and still, people would rather set themselves on fire than accept your invitation to supper. Let's wander a bit further down the road to the psychological side of this life. What did it feel like to grow up in the hangman's house? We don't have many first-hand accounts, for obvious reasons, but there are fragments, letters, court testimonies, and parish notes that give us glimpses. Many executioners' children carried deep shame. Some tried to run away to join monasteries, only to be rejected because of their bloodline. Others disguised their parentage to become soldiers or merchants. A soft beginning. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back through time to a part of history most people don't like to think about. Not battles or kings or the usual royal chaos, but something far more personal. Something universal. Tonight, we're talking about what happened after dinner. Yes, tonight's question is the one historians usually answer with a nervous cough. What did ancient people actually use? For toilet paper? So, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe light a candle, though preferably not the kind that smells like linen. Given where this is going, because while humanity has invented pyramids, cathedrals, and space travel, it took us a very long time to agree on the best way to clean ourselves, and the results, as we'll see, were deeply inconsistent. Let's start with the basics. The modern roll of soft, two-ply, perfumed toilet paper, that little white symbol of civilization, is actually younger than the light bulb. It didn't exist before the mid-1800s, which means that, for the vast majority of human history, people had to get creative. And they did, in ways that tell you far more about ancient life than you might expect. Because how people wiped, or didn't, depended on their class, their climate, and their access to what one Roman poet called the necessary stick. So, let's drift back about 2,000 years to ancient Rome, the empire of marble, aqueducts, and, yes, communal bathrooms. Roman public latrines were marvels of engineering and nightmares of privacy. Rows of smooth stone seats, carved with keyhole openings, lined up side by side over flowing water channels. No walls, no partitions, just a long, echoing room where senators, soldiers, and shopkeepers all sat shoulder to shoulder, discussing politics while attending to nature. And when they were done, they reached for the tersorium, a long stick with a sponge tied to the end. That was the Roman equivalent of toilet paper, a communal sponge used by everyone, washed between uses in a bucket of water or vinegar, depending on the budget and the hygiene standards of the day. So, yes, the same sponge, shared repeatedly, because, of course, it was. Now, before you recoil, remember, Romans genuinely thought this was sophisticated. Running water, stone benches, designated cleaning tools. It all looked very advanced compared to the alternatives, and, to be fair, in some ways it was. They even had clever plumbing systems to rinse the waste away. The sewers of Rome were famous. The Cloaca Maxima, or Great Drain, was one of the earliest public sanitation works in the world. Still, the idea of sitting next to your neighbor, chatting about taxes while using the same sponge, well, let's just say the ancient world had a different definition of intimacy. But Rome wasn't alone in its inventiveness. Let's drift east, to ancient China, where civilization was busy inventing paper, gunpowder, and bureaucracy. The Chinese were the first known culture to actually use paper for hygiene. Records from the 6th century mention sheets of soft paper made specifically for the bathroom. But even that was a luxury item. The imperial court of the Tang dynasty reportedly used perfumed paper sheets made from rice, straw, and mulberry bark, large, soft, and delicately scented. A far cry from the Roman sponge bucket. Meanwhile, the average person probably relied on bamboo spatulas, reeds, or sand, because progress, as always, was not evenly distributed. By the 14th century, under the Ming dynasty, the royal household was reportedly supplied with 720,000 sheets of toilet paper every year, which tells us two things. First, that someone was counting, and second, that being emperor came with certain, let's say, comforts of the throne. Other ancient cultures took different approaches, guided by geography and necessity. In the desert regions of the Middle East, where water was precious but sand was plentiful, people relied on the istinja tradition, using smooth pebbles or, if available, washing with water by hand. In fact, water cleansing became a long-standing cultural and religious practice, especially in Islamic societies, one that survives in many regions today. It's hygienic, sustainable, and arguably much more effective than paper. Meanwhile, in colder parts of Europe, things got rougher. Literally. Before paper reached the continent, most medieval Europeans used whatever they could find: grass, hay, moss. In coastal areas, seashells. In forests, handfuls of leaves chosen carefully. Because some mistakes, you only make once. And then there were the Vikings. They lived in a world of long winters, frozen ground, and limited plant life, not ideal conditions for moss collection. So, Norsemen often used scraps of wool, snow, or animal fur. Archaeologists even found evidence of toilet sponges in Viking settlements. Animal hair wrapped around sticks, eerily similar to the Roman tersorium. Apparently, humanity loves reinventing the same questionable ideas. In Japan, the early solution was even more creative. Before paper was common there, people used flat wooden sticks called chugi, about 8 inches long, shaped like miniature spatulas, one end for scraping, the other for pushing away debris. And yes, these were often reused, sometimes cleaned in a basin, sometimes not. Japanese monasteries even had designated areas near rivers for these rituals, a kind of spiritual meets hygienic process, which makes sense when you think about it. Few things encourage contemplation of impermanence, like washing a communal toilet, stick in a freezing stream. Meanwhile, in the frozen north, early Russians and Finns used bundles of straw, vilya, tied together like a brush. They kept them near the outdoor privies, which were usually wooden huts over holes in the ground, and in particularly cold winters, snow itself was used, surprisingly effective, though admittedly brisk, refreshing even, in the most regrettable way. But not every culture had to improvise. Some ancient civilizations turned sanitation into art. The ancient Greeks, for instance, used small ceramic discs called pessoi, literally pebbles, smooth, rounded pieces of broken pottery, sometimes carved from stone. They were washed and reused, though, and this is true, some had names engraved on them, usually the names of political enemies. So, yes, the Greeks literally wiped with the names of people they disliked. Philosophically speaking, it's almost poetic. Over time, these small, practical rituals became strangely revealing. They tell us what ancient people valued: comfort, cleanliness, modesty, or, occasionally, revenge. They also reveal the deep divide between rich and poor, because if you were a king, you didn't have to reach for moss or pebbles. You had servants. In medieval Europe, royal grooms of the stool. Yes, that was the actual title. Were responsible for assisting kings in their most personal moments. Their job description included helping the monarch dress, undress, and manage the aftermath of digestion. And the position wasn't humiliating, it was honored, because the person who handled the king's most private, business also had his ear, figuratively and literally. They were trusted more than almost anyone else in the palace. So, while peasants wiped with straw, the king's closest adviser was holding something far more delicate. A symbol of loyalty few were eager to earn. Of course, we also have to mention the ancient Egyptians, because, for all their engineering brilliance, they never quite solved this particular puzzle. Papyrus, while abundant, was expensive, so only the wealthy might have used scraps of it for cleaning. Everyone else used sand, water, or occasionally, and I wish this were an exaggeration, pieces of broken pottery. If that sounds painful, well, it probably was. The desert has many virtues. Cushioning is not one of them. Even the Bible offers an indirect glimpse of ancient hygiene. Deuteronomy 23:13, for instance, instructs soldiers to carry a small spade so they could cover up that which cometh from thee. Essentially, an early field manual on latrine etiquette. It's oddly comforting to realize that, across empires and centuries, humans have always agreed on one thing. Whatever happens, please bury it. By the medieval period, European castles had upgraded somewhat.